Welcome back for week 15 of the NHL Power Rankings. A day late because the Kraken played on Sunday. It didn't go particularly well, so would have been perfectly fine if we just ignored that game, but I do all the Kraken games, so Power Rankings slide one day, and did end up changing a little bit with the games here on Monday night. Though with that being said, there really wasn't a ton of movement in the Power Rankings this week from last week, at least not as far as teams moving above or below the teams that were right around them in last week's rankings. With a couple of exceptions, one team that moves way up, and you can probably guess who that's going to be, and a team that moved down a few spots. Otherwise, most of the teams kind of stayed where they were at. And that lack of convincing play by a lot of the teams towards the top of the standings also means that the two honorable mentions, honestly I probably could skip honorable mentions, but I'll just briefly mention the two teams that are just outside the top 10 right now and could hop into it next week if things go well for them and not well for teams towards the bottom of the list. Those being the Philadelphia Flyers and Vegas Golden Knights, really in no particular order. I'd probably put the Flyers above the Golden Knights right now, but they're pretty close, and the two of them just outside the top 10, and again could very well be in it next week if things go well for them. Starting off then in the 10th spot, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs, which you can see right away that this once again is quite a lot of, like I said, mid in this top 10 as far as how these teams played this week. Just kind of the way it worked out that most of the teams towards the top of the standings that have been playing well all season long had kind of unconvincing weeks. None of them really terrible weeks, aside from one team that we'll get to that was towards the top of the list last week that's definitely dropped a few spots. But for the Leafs, it was a loss-win type of week. They started with a loss to the Oilers, then a win against the Flames, lost to the Canucks, and then of course Samsonov has to have pretty much his best game of the season against the Kraken for their second win of the week. If it wasn't for that win and the Kraken had won that game, which boy would I have liked that to be the case, then they probably would have dropped out of the top 10, but since they go even on the week, they can stay inside the top 10 here in 10th, dropping just the one spot. Now obviously for the Leafs, as most people know because that's what the media focus is on, it has not been a particularly great run here of late as they had lost 4 straight coming into this week where they go every other, so it still has been a stretch of 6 losses in 8 games. But it seems like they're starting to maybe turn things around or at least tread water, which is better than what they'd done the week before, and the only reason they're really still in the top 10 from that terrible week is that they had worked themselves up towards the top half of this list. Anyway, for now they stay in the top 10 just barely, and then just above them in the 9th spot as we move fairly quickly through these, as again this is a day late, we'll have another Power Rankings here in less than a week's time. I have the Carolina Hurricanes. For the Hurricanes, their last 10 games has looked pretty good, a 7-2-1 record. But this week was, well, the worst part of that is they go 1-2 on the week, including 2 5-2 losses on either end of a 4-2 win. Those 2 losses to the LA Kings, who have been struggling of late, and the Minnesota Wild, who it does seem like they're starting to turn things around, but again have not had the best run of it here in the new year. Now, yes, that is just 2 games with those 2 losses, but it is 10 goals between those 2 losses, which does have to give at least a little bit of concern, I would imagine, to Canes fans, or flashbacks at the very least to the start of the season, where goaltending cost them a lot of points in the standings for a team that otherwise could be higher in the standings than they already are at this point. And yes, 3 of those 10 goals in those 2 losses were empty netters, 2 of them coming in the game against the Wild, but at the same time, in that game against the Wild, Raanta had already given up 3 goals on just 19 shots, actually 17 shots for the Wild, as 2 of those shots are the empty netters at the end that end up going in. So yeah, letting in 3 goals on 17 shots is probably not the production you want out of your goaltending. Raanta has been playing every start now for a while, so maybe if they get a little bit more of a platoon going, that could help things, but it has to be at least a little bit, concerning at the very least, I would have to say. Especially considering their next 2 games are against the Bruins, who have been back to being very good of late, and then the New Jersey Devils, who definitely know how to score. So we'll find out before this All-Star break whether or not it's going to be something the Canes are going to have to think about coming out of the All-Star break once we get into February. Up next in the 8th spot, I have the Dallas Stars, who also have a bit of an up and down week. They go alternating win-loss, though the second loss is an overtime loss, so they still end up going 2-1-1 on the week, an over NHL 500 week for them, which is better than a lot of teams in this top 10 can say, and for that reason, they did jump the Canes on the list this week, with a win against the Kings 5-1, then a pretty bad loss to the Flyers 5-1 again, but recover to get a 4-2 win and then lose in overtime at the end of the week. So for the Stars, it hasn't been a red-hot resurgence like some other teams in the NHL, but it still has been a trend upwards from a bit of a lull they had there in early December, and a Stars team that seems like they're right back in a solid place to be one of those top 3 teams in the Central Division. And at the very least, it has to be pretty encouraging for Stars fans that they're getting good to very good goaltending pretty much every night here since Ottinger's return, aside from his first game back, but we already talked about that last week. This week, the 2 games that he did play of those 4, he looked pretty good. I mean, he follows up back-to-back games giving up just 1 goal with the game where he does give up 5, but at the same time, one of those was a shorthanded rush chance, another was a penalty shot, and at the end of the day, it was really more the skaters that were to blame in that game, as the Stars got absolutely shelled, giving up almost 3 times as many shots on Ottinger as they got at the other end of the ice, with Ottinger facing 43 shots, while the Stars only got 15 at the other end. So yeah, not a great night for Ottinger, but at the same time, he was kind of put in a place where that was going to be the outcome one way or the other. And then you follow that up with a couple of back-to-back games for Wedgwood, where he gives up just 2 games in regulation and does give up the overtime winner in the final game, but still 5 goals in 2+ games, with the overtime period being that plus. Real quick, sorry about the lack of video for this one, but I noticed while editing that I somehow completely forgot to mention the team that I had in 7th, which is the New York Rangers. Now for the Rangers, it did look like they were going to have a bounce back week after a tough stretch there with a 5-2 win over the Kraken, even if Seattle was dealing with the flu and a sudden burst of injuries. Either way, a good win for them to start off the week. But then they slipped back to 2 straight losses to Vegas and LA, 5-1 to Vegas and 2-1 to LA, but the Kings have been struggling, as I already said. And then they finish off the week with a win, but it's to the Ducks, so, not necessarily a win that you wouldn't have already expected them to come away with. Either way, another 2-2 week for another team on this list, and for the Rangers, it's at least better than what it had been the week previous. Moving on though to the 6th spot, I have the Florida Panthers, who I could be convinced to put in the 5th spot. Their win against Nashville to finish up the week certainly puts it in a little bit better perspective than how it starts, with 3 consecutive losses to make it 4 straight. Now the first 2 are overtime losses, so they at least pick up 4 points in 4 games this week, but they still are overtime losses to the Anaheim Ducks and the Red Wings, who have been playing better of late. But the Ducks, that's especially not a great overtime loss. And then they do add a regulation loss, 6-4 to the Wild, to the end of that 4-game stretch where they lost every game. Like I said, they do finish it up with that 4-1 win over a Predators team that's been surprisingly competitive this year, still sitting in a wildcard spot in the West, so a pretty decent win. But I'm going to have to be convinced to move them back into the top 5 or towards that 3rd spot that they were last week, with some wins strung together once again after they strung together those losses. And then in the 5th spot, starting out the top 5 of this list, I have the Colorado Avalanche, though like I just said, they and the Panthers are pretty close to each other. The Panthers definitely closing right back up to the Avalanche with that win over the Predators. But for the Avalanche, while they still do have the same 4 points in 4 games this week, they do at least get 2 wins in the standings, with a similar week to what the Leafs had, with a loss, then a win, then a loss, then a win, but with a lot more goals, as both of those wins featured 7 Avalanche goals. One of the losses was a 5-2 loss to Boston, which doesn't look great, but at the same time, it is a Boston team that has been very good here of late. So ultimately, the loss between the 2 that I think reflects more poorly on the Avalanche would be the 4-3 loss, which is closer, but to the Montreal Canadiens. Either way, for the Avalanche, they are pretty much treading water at this point, which is all they really have to do to make the playoffs as one of the top 3 teams in the Central. If they want to be the top seed in the Central, they definitely will have to pick it up to catch the Jets, and pass them for that matter. So yeah, there's still some work to be done for the Avalanche, and they could do it if they can be a little bit more consistent. At the very least, they can put up a lot of goals when they're on their game, and they proved that once again this week. And then up next in the 4th spot, we have a team that would be in the 1st spot if I just did this based on the last couple weeks or the last month plus in their particular case. But it is a team that started off as, in early November, is well noted, one of, if not the worst teams in the NHL. But now, after having gotten a bit hot and now 13 consecutive wins, the Edmonton Oilers find themselves as one of the best teams in the NHL and now in the top 3 in the Pacific Division, helped in part by the collapse of the LA Kings. But nonetheless, it's a historic run by the Oilers, the best win streak in franchise history for them by a long shot already with these 13 consecutive wins. So even if it hasn't always been convincing for the Oilers, and it certainly hasn't been in the last 6 of those wins, with 3 straight 1-goal games, including 2 overtime wins, leading into this week where they have back-to-back 4-2 wins over Toronto and Seattle, both of which they were down 2-0 at one point, and in the game against Seattle, they nearly had that game tied back at 3, if it wasn't for a disallowed goal for the Kraken, thanks to a boneheaded offside by a former Oiler. Then finish off the week with what is basically a 2-1 win over the Flames with an empty netter at the end. Either way, for the Oilers, they continue to find ways to win, and surprisingly, it's not by goal scoring, it's more often by good defense and goaltending. 2 things that you could not have imagined would have been true about this team this season at the beginning of it. But now in the last 11 of these 13 wins, they have yet to give up 3 goals in a game. Now again, just to be clear, because I know there will be people in the comments that will say the Oilers should be number 1, the reason they aren't number 1 is because with my power rankings, I do put at least some weight in the season as a whole, and the Oilers had that terrible start while the 3 teams above them have still been playing very well of late, not double-digit consecutive wins, but also have the good start to the season and just consistently good play to back up the good play that they've had here recently as well. Starting out with, in 3rd place, the Winnipeg Jets. Now for the Jets, it is a second straight week of dropping a spot as they were 2 weeks ago in the top spot, and they still have been playing pretty well of late, but I couldn't have them in the 2nd spot because, well, they just lost to the team on Monday that is now in the 2nd spot. Either way though, for the Jets, it has been an incredible run here over the last couple of months, and even just this week after having their 8-game win streak and 14-game point streak snapped at the end of last week, they still come and win 2 of their 3 games this week, even if they do lose the final game of it to the Bruins and give up in the process 4 goals for the first time since November and more than 2 goals for the first time in 14 games. So when it comes to good defense and goaltending, even for as good as the Oilers have been, this team in the Jets has kind of been the class of good defense and goaltending for a good stretch of time now in the NHL. And while we're on the subject, I gotta say, if I was a Jets fan, I get that you gotta try to make it to overtime and get at least 1 point out of a game, but when you're down 2 and have a streak like the Jets did of not giving up more than 3 goals in a game, it's got to be a little bit disappointing to finally give up that 4th goal with an empty netter at the end of a game you're probably going to lose anyway. Either way, it was an incredible streak for the Jets when it came to giving up 3 or fewer goals, and almost equally incredible streak of 2 or fewer goals, which was snapped by the 3rd goal for the Bruins, an empty netter in the 3rd period, so yeah, that's got to be a pretty disappointing way to lose that streak. And of course, with that 4-1 win for the Bruins over the Jets, they do move up into the 2nd spot, right back in the top of these power rankings, or near the top of them anyway, trying to reclaim that top spot that they had for a little bit at the start of the season. Maybe just 1 week. The Golden Knights actually had it for a few weeks. Either way, the Bruins working their way back up this list. Now the team with the 2nd longest winning streak in the NHL to, of course, the Oilers, having won 5 straight and a point streak of, I think it's 8 or 9 straight themselves. Now for Boston, they too have been very good at defense and goaltending, just generally keeping the puck out of their net, though they do not have the incredible streak of games of giving up 2 or fewer goals or even 3 or fewer goals that the 2 teams just below them have been able to do here recently, as they did give up 4 goals just a couple games ago, but they scored 9 the other way. So this is a team that, yeah, as much as we'd like them to, just will not go away. They lose 3 straight, all of them in overtime or the shutout, but they lose 3 straight, and then bounce right back with 5 straight wins and look once again like a team that's going to be very hard to beat any given night, and is going to be, well, I mean, who knows once the playoffs come. We thought they'd be a hard out in the playoffs last year, and they still managed to lose to the Panthers, so saying they're a hard out in the playoffs is probably not something I can really go and say when they lost in the first round last year. Either way, this is once again a very good team, even if they do look quite different than last year's group. And yes, that does then mean that for the 2nd week running, in the 1st spot, it's the Vancouver Canucks, currently leading the NHL when it comes to the race for the President's Trophy. Not that that's necessarily a coveted trophy, with the maybe superstitious, but certainly at least coincidental poor performances that President Trophy winners tend to have in the playoffs, at least recently anyway. But for the Canucks, it has been an incredible season. They continue to play great game after great game, with yet another 3-game winning streak to finish off their week, even if it did start with a bit of a stumble and a 4-3 overtime loss to the Blue Jackets, a team they really shouldn't be losing to, but they still pick up the 1 point and keep their 9-game point streak alive after they were coming off of 5 consecutive wins coming into that game. So saying it's a 9-game point streak, it's 8 wins and 1 overtime loss for the Canucks, who are, yeah, straight up just the best team in the NHL when it comes to certainly their performance on the season as a whole. And on top of all of that for the Canucks, as much as I hate to admit it, I don't know if there's a team in the NHL that's better suited to the description of a team that consistently just finds ways to win. Sure, the Oilers do have 13 straight games, and it would be nice to be like the Oilers or the Jets and just not give up goals very much, if at all. But for the Canucks, while they do occasionally give up 3 or 4 goals, they consistently find ways to score more goals than their opponents. Take this week, for example, where they have a couple of low-scoring games, finishing off the week with a 2-0 shutout of the Blackhawks and a 2-1 win earlier on in the week against the Coyotes. But between those 2 wins, they have a 6-4 win over the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Maple Leafs score 4 goals against the Canucks, but they still find a way to score more than the Leafs and stay ahead of them long enough to get those 2 points in the standings with a regulation win. So for the Canucks, they're finding ways to win in all sorts of different ways, and ultimately, again, while it would be nice to give up 2 or fewer goals every game, that's just not going to happen over the course of a full season, so being able to score in bunches when you need to is a good thing to be able to do, and the Canucks clearly have been able to do that, which, I mean, obviously, especially the Oilers should be able to score in bunches as well, but the Canucks are scoring when they need to, which, yeah, I don't know. You get the point. They're finding all sorts of different ways to win games, and that is an encouraging sign for a team that has been consistently good all season long. But anyway, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. What teams you think I have too high, too low, what your top 10 list would look like, and just in general how you're feeling about this NHL season and the team you cheer most for coming into this All-Star break, which, by the way, once again, this Power Rankings will be a bit off schedule for week 16, as I'm going to do it once all games are done and we are going into the All-Star break, as I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to do another Power Rankings next Sunday and then have to do another one after a lot of teams will not have played any games and a few teams will have maybe played 1 or maybe 2 more. So yeah, we'll do the next Power Rankings, the week 16 ones, once the All-Star break has started, and then obviously a bit of a break with the All-Star break in there before the week 17 Power Rankings, which will be coming out the week after the All-Star break returns, as it returns, I think, for most teams start playing again on Saturday the 10th. So we're usually recording happening on Sundays for these. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense to do a Power Rankings where most teams have played 1 or 2 or maybe no games. So we'll get back to it with a bit of a larger week on the 17th, or I guess it would be 19th is when the Power Rankings will be back. I'll record on the 17th or 18th. Either way, you get the point. We'll be back in late February with the Power Rankings for week 17. Week 16 coming up here will be the last ones when the All-Star breaks start. With all that said, if you have made it to this point, thank you once again very much for watching these Power Rankings video. If you did like or enjoy it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that helps support the channel. Like and subscribe, of course. I'd appreciate you using them. If you made it to this point, you probably did like or enjoy at least something about it. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and yeah, maybe I just won't mention the Kraken again, since I give them an honorable mention and they lose 4 straight. Yeah. Anyway.